Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today we'll be talking about 10 tips for Set 4 Patch 1020. These are tips to help aid those returning to TFT and are a bit overwhelmed by the new set. We'll be covering a wide range of general tips about econing, scouting, positioning, and just useful things to remember. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. We have quite a few tips pertaining to the chosen mechanic of Set 4, but before we dive into those, let's begin with a couple that apply to the game in general. Our number 10 tip is to use your early components to make useful items. This tip won't apply to every game because there are times you get far less components early game than you might normally. But on average, you're going to have at least 3 components after the first 3 PvE rounds and at least 5 or 6 after Krugs. What this means, and what we're talking about in regards to this tip, is that oftentimes players will hold onto their components for far too long instead of making a useful item right away. For example, if you begin the game with 3 components and 2 of them are a tear and a glove, it's okay to just make a Hand of Justice. Why? Because that item is universally strong on a lot of champions. So a bit of game knowledge does come into play, but it won't take long to figure out what items do well overall. Of course, we're not advocating that you use all of your components right away. You should have at least 1, maybe 2 components on your item bench to give yourself options later on. That said, making early items is a great way to increase your composition's power, which can result in either less health loss per round or actually being able to be on a win streak. Our next 2 tips are about scouting and positioning, as those two go hand in hand most of the time. The number 9 tip for today's list is to make sure that you're scouting frequently. This is a tip that you've likely heard many times, as scouting is an important part of playing TFT. You're always presented with nearly perfect information on other players' boards simply by looking at it. There's a whole range of information including items, upgraded champions, their synergies, and how they're positioned. Even gold is scoutable, albeit you're only able to see when they've hit certain interest thresholds, but it's enough info to see if they spent a lot or not. What all this means is that you want to get into the habit of scouting frequently. This is a habit that you'll have to work on over time, but a good rule of thumb is to at least scout after every important event in the game. After a carousel round, a PvE round, or standard leveling intervals are all great times to scout. For example, most players go to level 7 around 4-1 after Wolves. If you scout that round and the round after, you're going to get a ton of information on what other players have hit when they're rolling or what they've played after leveling. All in all, scouting is a great tool for a game like TFT, as information is paramount to getting an advantage over other players. But with that said, knowing how to use that information is important, which brings us to our next tip. Our number 8 tip for today is to reposition your board often. Okay, in a vacuum, this tip sounds odd, as just moving pieces around your board doesn't seem like it does a lot or have much use. But it actually can be useful to move your champions around frequently, especially important champions like your main carry or a unit with powerful CC. And of course, as we said, you want to base a lot of your repositioning on what you scout. The general idea behind moving your board every round or so is that you're throwing other players off of scouting you. In the late game, you have to be a lot more active in scouting and repositioning, but early and mid game, there's too many players to specifically position around for one person. That means keeping your units in different positions can help throw off players that have scouted you. Of course, late game, you also want to reposition often, but this is done with scouting as well. Check the players remaining and see who you've played against and prepare for who you haven't. Keep your carries away from the obvious crowd control and position your champions with CC in a place where they're going to get the most value. If you use both scouting and positioning effectively, it will honestly help you place higher consistently. Alright, our next 2 tips will be about econ. The number 7 tip for today is to make sure you're not overspending your gold when rolling. A lot of players will probably scoff at this tip because it's honestly a very common thing to do. Overspending is an issue for even the best of players because you're just a few upgrades away from being strong, and if you just hit, and then before you know it, all of your gold is gone and you have no economy to roll later on. Most of the time, this is going to happen around level 7 for the current meta. Going 7 and rolling is what a majority of players are doing, but you don't need to go all in with your gold unless you're on very low health. If you're below 30 health, then yes, spend that gold. Otherwise, spend just enough to find 1 or 2 upgrades and then stop. Preferably, you don't want to go below 20 or 30 gold, as that's a good amount to have to still be able to econ effectively. The same is true later on at level 8, but the later the game goes, the more gold you're going to need to spend, so this tip mainly pertains to those mid-game levels of 6 and 7. Let's keep the econ theme going with the number 6 tip being don't buy too many champions. In previous sets, it was okay to buy out your shop if it didn't cost you interest, but in set 4, in general, buying too many champions is not only detrimental to your economy, but also affects the odds of finding champions in your shop. Before we get to that second part, let's go over a common mistake that new players can make. They have gold, so they spend it by buying out their shop each round. It's easy to say not to do this, but it's also important to know that spending too much gold on champions, especially early on in the game, will slow your economy down a lot. Make it a goal each game to spend less early on and aim to hit 50 gold by the mid-game. This should help new players cull the overspending habit. Now, the second part of buying too many champions is due to the shop change in set 4. If you don't buy a champion in your shop, the next shop will not have that champion in it. An example is early on in the game, you may not want Fiora, so you don't buy her. That means that your next shop will guarantee not have her. The chosen mechanic does ignore this rule, but otherwise, you can use it to manipulate your shop a bit. Overall, buying too many champions, especially early on, is a habit worth breaking. Our fifth tip today is a quick one, but one you should know. Use Quicksilver on your carry. This is definitely a generalization, as there are games where your main carry may not need a Quicksilver, or you just weren't able to find it. But the vast majority of games, you can and should try to get a Quicksilver for your carry, because there's just so much CC in set 4. There's stuns, blinds, displacement effect, attack speed reductions, and slows, and all other sorts of crowd control to mess up your carry and lose you the round. Quicksilver negates practically all of that for 12 seconds and allows your carry to actually play the game. So make it a habit of trying to get this item for most of your games. We've got 2 more tips about econing. The number 4 tip is knowing when to level to push for a power spike. First off, it's just a good idea in general to know the standard leveling times. Those are level 5 around 2.5, level 6 around 3.2, and level 7 around 4.1. They aren't hard and fast rules to follow, but in general, players will be hitting those levels around those times. Always keep in mind whether you're leveling or not on those turns. With that knowledge in mind, it's good to know when you should level to push your board's advantage. This often means breaking away from standard leveling intervals to catch other players off guard. It's not always advisable if it costs you too much gold, but let's say, for example, you hit a 3-cost chosen on Krugs or 3-1. Before this, you really haven't been winning, but now you're strong. In this example, you'll want to go to level 6 early on 3-1 to push your power spike. The same goes for any other time in the game when you hit a big upgrade. That said, in the late game, it's not feasible to suddenly level to 8 or 9, but early on in the game, it's a great way to earn a quick advantage. Along the same line of thinking as the previous tip, our number 3 tip for today is know when to roll instead of leveling to 9. We can cover both sides of this tip, but first we have to talk about level 9 in general for set 4. They made a change to increase the cost of leveling to 8 and 9 in set 4, with level 9 costing a whopping 80 gold. That's where this tip comes into play. Because it's such an investment to go to level 9, a lot of games it's usually just better to roll instead of leveling. Consider the fact that you're not going to level 9 immediately and have to do it over the course of a few rounds. That's gold you can instead be spending to roll slowly. And if you need to all in because you're low on health, having 50 to 60 gold to roll is a significant amount. On the other hand, there are times when leveling to 9 is okay to do. Generally, you should only aim to do this if you're in a stable position to do so, meaning you're not losing each round super hard. Ultimately, what it comes down to is thinking about what you gain by leveling to 9 or not. That 80 gold spent leveling is a lot of potential upgrades, so if you need those, it's better to roll. If you can safely level to 9 and you have the econ left over to roll, then it's okay to level. Either way, you need to consider your options instead of spamming the level up button. Our last 2 tips have to do with the chosen mechanic of set 4. The number 2 tip is to use strong early chosen champions. This does require a small bit of game knowledge, but just by playing or watching streams, you should be able to get an idea of what chosen traits are worth grabbing early on in the game. But the gist of this tip is that you want to buy a chosen when you can to help transition you into later stages of the game. Cultist Chosen, for example, is an extremely powerful chosen to find early game and can easily result in a win streak. If you're not buying a chosen in the first few rounds of stage 2, then you'll most likely need to find one around Krugs or early stage 3. Basically, don't skip out on playing a Chosen just because it doesn't fit into your plans for the mid game. Use them as a transitional tool to lose less health or maybe even win streak. And our last tip today, coming in at number 1, is that you shouldn't hold onto a Chosen champion for too long. Basically, this tip and the previous go hand in hand. After you've bought a Chosen, you may find yourself wanting to invest in it more by building a composition around them or even picking up more of the champion. Most of the time, though, you're going to be better off using the Chosen for a stage and then selling it. This can be applied to any stage, though late in the game, you're a bit too locked into your Chosen, so selling it isn't always reasonable. Early in mid-game, though, think about your Chosen unit as a stepping stone. Use it to win streak or minimize health loss, and then sell it once you have the economy to roll for a better Chosen that fits what comp you're in. Overall, the Chosen mechanic is incredibly versatile, so you have room to make choices with it. Don't limit yourself to one Chosen all game simply because you hit it early. Be willing to sell it to transition towards a stronger composition later on. That is going to be it for today's video, folks. As we're on the 4th set of TFT, a lot of the game has been figured out, but there's still always new players or room for improvement for veterans. We hope that these tips will be useful in helping you climb higher on the ladder. Let us know in the comment section below if you have any extra tips to provide. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.